Welcome to Crime Documentary, where we uncover the untold truths behind history's most shocking crimes. Today, we take you back to September 6, 1901, in Buffalo, New York, a day that forever changed America. It was a time of progress, invention, and optimism, yet hidden in the crowd was a man with darkness in his heart and a gun in his pocket. His target, the President of the United States. This is not just the story of an assassination. It's a chilling journey into the mind of a killer and the tragic downfall of a beloved leader. The Pan-American Exposition in Buffalo was a spectacle unlike anything most Americans had ever seen before. Its sprawling grounds filled with towering buildings gleaming under the late summer sun, fountains bursting into sprays of crystal mist, electric lights strung overhead even in the daytime, promising to blaze into wonder after sunset. Crowds poured through the gates from every direction, families with children, wide-eyed soldiers in crisp uniforms, young couples arm in arm, businessmen with stiff collars and polished shoes, all drawn by the promise of seeing the world of the future here in the present. The hum of voices rose and fell in waves, mixing with the distant clang of machinery, the soft strains of music, and the calls of vendors selling treats and souvenirs. On that September afternoon, there was an added excitement. Threading through the fair, a magnetic pull drawing thousands toward the Temple of Music, the ornate domed building where the President of the United States, William McKinley, was scheduled to greet the public. For many, this was not just a chance to see a leader from afar, but to stand before him, shake his hand, and feel part of the great American story itself. McKinley was not a man of aloof formality. He was known for warmth, for genuine interest in the people he met, and in a time when the nation was still finding its place in the new century, such moments mattered. They gave ordinary citizens a sense that they too belonged to the forward march of history. As the hour approached, the crowd outside the temple thickened. Guards tried to maintain order, but the throng swelled, pressing inward, everyone craning their necks for a glimpse of the president. Somewhere in that crowd was Czolgosz, a slight, pale man in his late 20s, with sharp eyes and a restless manner. He had been at the fair for 2 days, walking the grounds, studying the routines of the guards and the schedule of the president. He had made his decision long before stepping through the gates that morning. In his mind, he was not simply another visitor. He was a man on a mission, one that he believed would strike at the very heart of a corrupt system. Leon had grown up in hardship, moving from place to place, working in factories and mills, his hands blistered from endless labor, his ears filled with the roar of machines. He had drifted toward the fiery speeches of anarchists who preached that governments were tools of the powerful and enemies of the working class. In their words, he found both anger and purpose. He came to see leaders not as protectors, but as oppressors, and to him, McKinley was the embodiment of that power, the man who represented the state he despised. Over the days he spent at the fair, he observed how the president's meet and greet was conducted, how citizens approached in a line, flanked by guards, how McKinley's right hand was free to extend in greeting, and how close each person could come before stepping aside for the next. He also noted the lack of thorough searches and the small moments where security attention faltered. Leon had purchased a small revolver in Buffalo, a cheap but deadly weapon, and now as he stood among the crowd, his right hand rested near his coat pocket, his left arm held stiff against his side. Wrapped in a white handkerchief, as though injured beneath that cloth, was the gun, hidden from view in the milling crowd. People chatted cheerfully, some speaking of their long journey to see the president, others remarking on the grandeur of the buildings. Leon spoke to no one, his eyes fixed on the entrance to the Temple of Music. He watched as the line moved slowly into the building, the guards letting people through in small groups. Inside, the air was cooler, the ornate walls echoing the murmur of voices, and the faint music drifting from the stage at the far end. President McKinley stood in a simple dark suit, his face open and kind, smiling as he greeted each visitor, shaking hands and exchanging a few words. It was a scene of order and civility, a tableau of the nation's ideals. Yet for Leon, it was a target within reach. As he edged closer, he could feel his heartbeat Quickened not from fear, but from the mounting pressure of the act he had envisioned so many times, he told himself. This was not murder, it was justice, the elimination of a figure who served the rich at the expense of the poor. The line shifted forward. And he was only a few people away. Now the president's voice was audible, warm and steady. He was speaking to a woman who clutched his hand with tears in her eyes, thanking him for his service. Leon's eyes flicked to the guards, noting their positions. One on each side of the president, two more watching the line, but none standing directly in his path. He adjusted the cloth around his left hand, tightening it slightly, feeling the cool metal beneath his palm. He had rehearsed the motion in his mind. Raised the hand level, the barrel fired twice quickly before they could stop him. A man ahead of him stepped forward, shook the president's hand and moved on. It was Leon's turn now, the moment when the crowd and the noise and the building itself seemed to fade into the background, leaving only him and the man he had come to kill. McKinley stepped forward, his right hand extended, a genuine smile on his face, as if meeting an old friend. Leon moved in, closing the distance, his eyes locking on the spot just over the president's heart. The world in that instant narrowed to the weight of the gun in his palm, the measured breath in his chest, and the belief burning in his mind that history would remember him not as a criminal, but as a man who acted when others would not. The electric light above glinted off the polished wood of the platform. The murmur of the crowd swelled just behind him, and his fingers tightened imperceptibly around the grip of the hidden weapon as the president's shadow fell across him. The air inside the Temple of Music was heavy with anticipation, the crowd moving in a slow, steady rhythm toward the president, each person waiting for that brief moment of contact that they would remember for the rest of their lives. The ornate dome above cast soft shadows across the polished floor, the flicker of sunlight slipping through the high windows catching on the gold trim of the walls. The band outside was still playing faintly, but the music barely reached those in line here. There was only the sound of shuffling feet and the low murmur of voices. The man ahead of Leon, Czolgosz, had just stepped aside, and now it was his turn. Every detail in the room seemed to sharpen in his vision. The dark fabric of McKinley's suit, the soft shine of his neatly combed hair, the open warmth in his expression, the way his right hand extended naturally to greet the next citizen. Leon stepped forward with a smooth motion, his left arm held close to his body, the white cloth still wrapped tightly around it, concealing the revolver he had brought for this very purpose. His eyes never left the president's chest. He did not look into the man's face, though it was only inches away. Instead, he focused on the point where the bullet would strike, where it would shatter the life of the leader of the United States forever. The moment felt stretched, as though time itself had slowed. Each step of the guards, each shift of the crowd behind him, every breath he drew seemed louder than the music or the murmurs around them. McKinley's hand was still outstretched, and Leon raised his wrapped hand, bringing the weapon into position in a movement so quick and practiced it seemed almost natural. The muzzle was hidden by the cloth, only inches from the president's body, the distance so small that it left no margin for error. There was no hesitation, no glance to the side, no final moment of doubt. Leon pulled the trigger. Once the crack of the revolver shattered the stillness, the sound echoing through the chamber as if the very walls recoiled from it. In the same motion he pulled again, firing a second shot. The people nearest the platform froze in shock, their faces caught between disbelief and terror as the sharp smell of gunpowder filled the air. McKinley staggered, his eyes wide, a flicker of pain crossing his face. The first bullet had struck a button on his coat, deflecting into the fabric, but the second tore into his abdomen, the force of it driving the breath from his lungs for a heartbeat. There was silence the moment between the shots and the reaction, so brief yet so vivid in the memory of every witness. Then the room erupted. A scream cut through the air, a woman gasping in horror, the heavy pounding of feet as the guards lunged forward. Two men nearest the president threw themselves at Leon, one striking his arm, sending the revolver clattering to the polished floor, another driving him backward into the crowd. The white cloth was torn from his hand, revealing the weapon. The guards swarmed him, their voices shouting commands, their fists striking with the force of trained instinct. The crowd pressed in, some crying out for his death, others frozen in place. Unable to move, McKinley had collapsed into the arms of an aide, his face pale, his lips moving in faint words. He raised a weak hand toward the men beating his attacker, telling them not to hurt him, even in the shock of the moment. His instinct was mercy. That simple act would be repeated in every newspaper across the nation as a testament to his character. The guards dragged Leon toward the side of the room, their grips like iron, as the crowd tried to surge forward, some shouting to kill him on the spot, others trying to catch a glimpse of his face. Leon himself offered no struggle. He kept his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the chaos, his voice quiet as he muttered words that few could hear, fragments about government, about oppression, about how he had done what was necessary. In the center of the room, McKinley was lowered gently to the floor, another aide pressing a handkerchief to the wound, blood staining the white cloth. Almost instantly, a doctor who had been in the crowd pushed through, kneeling beside the president, his brow furrowed. As he examined the injury, he called for more light, for bandages, for someone to summon a carriage to take McKinley to the hospital, the people nearest the scene stood stunned, their minds trying to grasp how, in the middle of such a celebration, in a place dedicated to art and music, the leader of the nation had been struck down. The noise outside grew as the news spread across the fairgrounds. The music from the band faltered and stopped, replaced by the distant shouts of messengers running to carry word to the authorities. The fair that had been a symbol of progress only minutes before was now the site of a national tragedy. The smell of smoke from the gun still lingered, the shockwave of the event still rolling through every soul present. The guards forced Leon out of the building into the sunlight, where the glare made him squint for the first time since he had fired the shots. His face showed a flicker of reaction, not fear exactly, but a narrowing of the eyes, as if bracing himself for what was to come. His hands were bound quickly, his body searched for any other weapons, finding none. He was shoved into a waiting police wagon while the crowd outside shouted curses and threats. McKinley was lifted carefully by 4 men. Each step they took a balance between speed and caution. His breath came shallow, but he tried to keep his composure, even managing to assure those around him that he was not badly hurt. The carriage jolted forward toward the Exposition Hospital, the wheels clattering against the cobblestones as the city itself seemed to hold its breath. Every clock in Buffalo ticked forward. Every sound seemed distant, as the fate of the president now rested in the hands of the doctors who would receive him in minutes. The carriage carrying President McKinley rattled across the Exposition grounds, its wheels striking the uneven stones as the driver urged the horses forward. The crowd parted only reluctantly, many still unaware of the full extent of what had happened. Inside the Temple of Music, some craned their necks to see the pale figure slumped within. Others called out questions that went unanswered. The guards flanking the carriage kept their eyes sharp, scanning for any further threat. The Exposition Hospital was not far, but every second seemed to stretch unbearably long. McKinley sat upright as much as he could, his right hand gripping the side of the seat, his other pressed to the wound through a quickly applied bandage. The pain was sharp, but he forced his features into a calm expression, unwilling to let those around him see fear. When the carriage reached the hospital, a team of doctors and nurses was already waiting. Word of the shooting had spread ahead of him, and they moved with an urgency that reflected the gravity of the moment. He was lifted from the carriage and carried inside the cool air of the hospital, contrasting sharply with the heat and noise outside. The room prepared for him was small but clean, the table draped with white linens that would soon be stained. The doctors examined him quickly, noting the location of the entry wound and the possibility that the bullet had lodged deep within his abdomen. One physician suggested immediate surgery, another warned of the risks. Given the facilities here in Buffalo and the lack of proper lighting and equipment, the decision was made to attempt removal of the bullet. Nonetheless, McKinley agreed without hesitation, telling them to do whatever they thought best. As preparations began outside in the fairgrounds, the scene had shifted dramatically. The joyful noise of the exposition was replaced by murmurs of disbelief and fear. Clusters of people gathered around messengers and newspaper boys, hungry for any scrap of news. About the president inside the hospital. The doctors worked steadily, their hands moving with precision under the dim electric light. The bullet had torn through muscle and tissue, lodging in a place difficult to reach. One attempt to locate it failed. Then another, the surgeons finally deciding to close the wound rather than risk further damage. They hoped the president's strong constitution would carry him through. As they finished, McKinley opened his eyes and asked for his wife Ida to be brought. To him she arrived, pale and trembling, yet composed enough to take his hand. He reassured her, speaking softly, that he would recover, that everything would be all right. His calm in the face of such pain moved those who stood nearby. The news was carried to the crowds outside that the president had survived the operation and was expected to recover. The sense of relief spread, quickly easing the tension, at least for the moment. People began to believe that perhaps this would not end in tragedy. Meanwhile, Leon Czolgosz sat in a guarded room within the city jail, his hands still bound, though the bonds were no longer necessary. He made no attempt to resist or escape. His gaze was distant. His voice when he spoke was flat and emotionless. He told the detectives who questioned him that he had acted alone, that he had come to Buffalo with the sole purpose of killing the president, that he believed the government was the enemy of the people, and that McKinley was its most visible symbol. He spoke of his admiration for anarchist thinkers, though some of those same thinkers had already denounced his act as misguided and harmful. He seemed unaffected by their disapproval. The detectives took notes, recording his statements in detail, but could not shake the impression that this was not a man who would be swayed by reason or remorse. Back at the hospital, the president appeared to rally over the next 2 days. His fever remained low, his appetite returned slightly, and he was able to speak with aides about matters of state. Though they urged him to rest, he expressed gratitude to those caring for him, even the guards who stood at his door. He asked again that no harm come to the man who had shot him, his words a reflection of the deep sense of duty and decency that had marked his life. Yet beneath this hopeful surface, trouble was brewing. The bullet that remained within his body had left fragments and tissue damage that no one could fully address with the resources at hand. Infection began to take hold slowly and silently. His doctors noticed the signs: first a slight rise in temperature, then a weakness in his pulse. The optimism of the first days began to fade. By the 5th day after the shooting, McKinley's condition had worsened significantly. The infection had spread beyond the wound, his body struggling to fight it. He grew weaker, drifting in and out of consciousness. Though when he was awake, he tried to speak words of comfort to his wife and those gathered at his bedside. Outside the hospital, the mood had turned somber. The crowds were quieter, their faces drawn with worry. The once dazzling fair now felt subdued, as if the very buildings had lost their luster. The temple of music stood closed, its ornate entrance guarded, as if sealing away the memory of what had happened within. On the evening of September 13th, the doctors informed those closest to the president that his condition was critical. Ida was brought to his side. He took her hand and whispered his love and his faith that they would meet again, whatever the outcome. Through the long night, the room was kept dim, the quiet broken only by the soft steps of the nurses and the ticking of the clock, each hour passing like a tolling bell. The next morning, September 14th, the president's breathing grew shallow, his voice barely audible. He murmured his final words: "It is God's way. His will be done," and then closed his eyes, his features settling into a peaceful stillness. The nation that had hoped and prayed for his recovery now faced the reality of loss. The news of President McKinley's death spread through Buffalo like a wave of sorrow, moving from street to street, carried by urgent whispers and the cries of newspaper boys who could barely keep pace with the demand for the latest editions. Across the nation, people stopped in their tracks as they read the headlines, struggling to believe that their leader was gone. The man they had trusted to guide them into a new century was no more. The fairgrounds that only days before had echoed with music and laughter now stood silent. The temple of music shuttered and guarded its grand arches, holding the ghost of that final moment. Government officials acted quickly to ensure stability. The Vice President, Theodore Roosevelt, took the oath of office, his face grave and his words measured. He knew that he had inherited the most powerful seat in the country. Under the darkest of circumstances, the transition was orderly, but it was heavy with grief. Trains carried McKinley's body on a funeral route that passed through cities and towns where thousands stood in hushed lines, some holding small flags, some holding their children close, all wanting to see the casket draped in the stars and stripes, even for just a fleeting second. Church bells tolled slow and steady, each strike marking another heartbeat of a nation in mourning. At the Capitol, his body lay in state, and the line of mourners stretched for hours. They moved quietly, their footsteps echoing through the great halls. People remembered his gentle voice, his warm smile, and the kindness he had shown to strangers and friends alike. Meanwhile, in the city jail, Leon Czolgosz waited for his trial. His cell was bare and cold, the walls closing in around him, yet he showed no fear and no remorse. He accepted the court-appointed counsel without question, speaking little and meeting every gaze with an unsettling calm. The trial began, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Dozens of eyewitnesses recounted the moment of the shooting. The revolver was presented, the bandaged hand described in chilling detail. The defense could offer nothing to change the inevitable. The jury returned a verdict of guilty without hesitation. The judge pronounced the sentence of death by electrocution, and the date was set for October 29th. When given the chance to speak, Czolgosz told the court that he had killed the president because he believed it was his duty, that he acted alone, and that he felt no regret. His words were steady and cold like steel, and they sent a ripple of unease through the courtroom outside. The public seethed at the thought of the man who had taken so much from them, yet there was no mob violence, no public lynching, only the grim machinery of justice moving toward its end. In the weeks before his execution, Czolgosz remained in his cell reading newspapers, eating little, and speaking to almost no one. A guard later said that he seemed utterly detached from the reality of his fate, as though he were simply waiting for an appointment rather than the end of his life. On the morning of October 29th, he was led from his cell to the execution chamber. The small room was cold, the electric chair standing in the center under harsh light. Witnesses from the press and the public were present. The air, heavy with anticipation, was seated, the straps tightened across his chest and limbs, the hood placed over his head. The warden asked if he had any last words, and he replied in a steady voice that he was not sorry for what he had done, and that he had acted for the good of the people. Moments later, the switch was thrown, the current surged through his body, and in seconds, it was over. The witnesses watched in silence, some with satisfaction, others with a deep sadness, knowing that while justice had been served, the wound in the nation remained raw. His body was buried in an unmarked grave to prevent anyone from turning the site into a shrine. In the days that followed, the country turned fully to honoring the memory of McKinley. Newspapers printed long accounts of his life, his service in the Civil War, his years in Congress, his election to the presidency, and his steady leadership during times of conflict. They printed his speeches, his words of unity, and his vision for an America strong and fair. Many wrote of the dignity he had shown in his final days, of his concern for his wife and for the people of the nation, even as his own life faded. The Pan-American Exposition continued for a short time, but it never truly recovered. The shadow of the assassination hung over it like a pall. Visitors passed the Temple of Music quietly, some stopping to look at it for a moment before moving on. The joy that had once filled the fairgrounds had been replaced by a heavy reminder that even in the most celebrated moments, danger can stand only a few steps away. In homes across America, portraits of McKinley were hung and draped with black ribbons. Families told their children about the man who had served with honor and met his fate with grace. In Washington, changes were made to protect future presidents. The Secret Service, which had been focused largely on counterfeiting, was given the permanent duty of guarding the nation's leader. The lessons learned in the days after McKinley's death shaped the security that would follow for generations, yet the memory of that day in Buffalo could not be erased. The image of the smiling president reaching out to shake hands, the sudden crack of gunfire, the stunned silence that followed lived on in the minds of those who had been there. History would remember the assassination not just as the death of a president, but as a moment when the optimism of a new century was jolted by the reminder that darkness can emerge from the crowd without warning. It was a lesson carved into the story of America in the blood of a leader whose final words had been of love and faith, and whose life had been given in the service of his people, the nation. Moved forward as it always must, but it carried with it the shadow of that day, and the knowledge that even the brightest light can be extinguished by a single hand in a single moment, and that is how the life of President William McKinley came to an end and how the course of a nation was forever changed.